After an inexperienced vice president and two property developers failed to secure a deal with Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, after the Strait of Hormuz were closed due to the US-Israeli attack on Iran, President Trump is now threatening to blockade the Strait of Hormuz and close the strategically important waterway, which is already closed. We'll be trying to unpick a conflict that the Great Orange One appears to have lost total control of, as the disastrous geopolitical consequences of his and his mate Bibi Netanyahu's actions play out. In better news, Trump's mate in Hungary, also a pal of Vladimir Putin, has lost his election after being in power for 16 years, whilst here at home the local government election campaigns have kicked off. With Labour and the Tories expecting a good kicking, what could this mean in our town, cities, and indeed in Wales and Scotland? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast. So I missed you last week, guys, but obviously you were joined by the very capable Martin Liptrot and had an enjoyable 45 minutes. So let's try and keep within the hour this week as well, and not get a reputation for Frank McKenna being the windbag that drags these podcasts
Surely
on.
not.
I had a fabulous time on Friday. Just a shout out to the Jockey Club and fantastic day in the chairman's suite at Aintree, where Victoria and I were treated to brilliant hospitality and also, would you believe, won a few bob, which is a very unusual experience for us. We usually come away a couple of £100 down, but we actually ended up being able to afford a nice takeaway when we returned home on Friday night. So, no, seriously, thanks to the Jockey Club. It was a great 3 days, obviously, at Aintree. And sadly, of course, there was a fatality in terms of one of the poor horses that had to be put down after it won the race, would you believe? Incredible. Broke its back, continued to run for the last sort of 100 metres or so, won the race, and then sadly had to be put down. But nonetheless, it didn't, thankfully, overshadow what was a great Grand National Festival for the 3 days. And our producer, Francesca, who usually remains quiet, I'm just going to say, Francesca, you can nod your head. I believe you had a great time at Hope Street Hotel, didn't you? Where they showed all the racing on a big screen, and I'm sure you were treated to fabulous hospitality too. So that was our Friday. Saturday, James, and you were watching the Argyle struggle to a draw against Exeter City, you were telling me. Bloody hell, what happened there, mate? They're getting relegated, aren't they?
Yeah, they were. We were seeing you're going down throughout the match. I'd like to say that there was a strong wind, and the corner flags were touching the ground. It was so strong they could hardly take the corners. So I think that was a bit of a level between the highly skilled Argyle and the less skilled Exeter. Nevertheless, their supporters were fantastic. Actually, outsung us, and the draw has killed our playoff hopes, I think.
And meanwhile, West Ham United 4, Wolves 0. I mean, what an incredible result that was. And then, of course, Tottenham, with their 99th manager in charge for the first time this season,
It's like the story
ends up going down at Sunderland. So you're out of the bottom 3, Joe.
Yes, we are. And that was a very much needed win, particularly after we were held to a draw with Leeds the previous week. So, we might just about stay up.
Well, it'd be nice to see the Hammers staying in the Premier League, and let's see what the next few weeks bring. But enough of this football and sporting chat. There's been one or two things happening in the world and in politics, of course. Where are we up to with this conflict with Iran? Clearly, the United States has lost total control, if it ever had control, of a strategic exit. It's clearly obvious now, I think, that what Trump anticipated was a similar scenario to that which occurred in Venezuela, when he was able to get in and out quickly, change the leadership, if not the regime, to be fair, but change the leadership to put in a place person who is far more friendly to him and has done some sort of deal on oil. And he thought he could do the same in Iran. And there was a really detailed story. It was almost like a novel that appeared in a short novel, obviously, that appeared in the New York Times last week. I don't know if you saw it, which basically outlined the role that Netanyahu played in convincing Trump that this would be an easy win. Netanyahu was actually sat in the Situation Room, would you believe, in the White House, having conversations with the president. And despite warnings from his vice president, J.D. Vance, from Marco Rubio, from some of the generals who have subsequently been sacked, of course, to say that this would not be as simple a military operation as Netanyahu and his Israeli colleagues were suggesting, Trump appeared to be as determined as Netanyahu to go ahead with the attack, and it's now resulted in chaos, not just putting Trump's own poll numbers in the toilet, but having a devastating effect on the economy of the whole world, it seems to me. So we're in a mess. He's in a mess. He sent J.D. Vance and a couple of property developers over to Islamabad to try and negotiate with the new Iranian regime, and was unable to secure a deal. And lo and behold, last night announces that he's going to blockade the Strait of Hormuz because he believes that Iran are making some cash out of the oil that is being exported, as little as it is. And he thinks this is wrong. And so it's, I think the phrase he used, everyone gets in and out, or no one gets in and out. Now, this causes some challenges for the military of the United States anyway, because, of course, we all know now the use of drones is the big weaponry that minor military forces such as Ukraine and Iran have. But the other claim he made, which has proved to be untrue, it now transpires, is that the UK and other European allies were going to get involved in this blockade. Starmer and Macron have denied that they're going to go anywhere near this because it is another breach of international law. So it's an absolute mess. I've given the edited highlights of what's been happening over the past 7 days. He's threatened genocide. He's been all over the place. You know, Vance, by the way, we'll come on to this later on, if he had any credibility left, coming away from those negotiations empty-handed has undermined him even further. And now we're in this ridiculous situation where Trump's saying, you think it's bad in the Strait of Hormuz? Hold my coat, you've seen nothing yet. Defend what this tactic might do, Jim, in terms of easing the situation.
One thing I think we need, because things develop by the hour, Frank, but the latest I've heard is that the American blockade is only on Iranian ships. He's trying to sort of cut if the Iranian ships come out of port, the normal Iranian commercial traffic and so on, that's what he's blockading. I don't think he's going to blockade international shipping, not that there's much of it, but I think that's an important sort of...
I think the problem is, Jim, though, it's not President Trump's call, is it, as to whether those ships sail through the strait or not, because the big challenge that they have, of course, is insurance, and they can't get any, because insurance companies are simply saying, we're either going to charge you an absolutely extortionate rate to sail your ships through that part of the world, or you don't sail them at all. And so the idea that Trump can put a couple of naval ships in there and decide who's going in and going out is for the birds, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the point. The American blockade would have to be sufficiently credible that the insurance companies would insure the international shipping, and that sort of level of commitment would be extremely expensive, extremely difficult to do. And, as you say, it's just this narrative of being drawn into things. It's a very dangerous situation because Trump has made an absolute fool of himself by getting into this position. And the trouble is with his temperament is to lash out rather than to acknowledge the position he's in, work with international partners and try and de-escalate this situation. So, it's very bad indeed. The other thing is one's increasingly hearing hostility to Israel in the United States. Now, everything I always say about Israel is caveated by my belief that Israel could not tolerate rockets being lobbed into it, whether it be from Gaza or from Lebanon. That is unacceptable, and I defend the Israeli state's right to stop that happening. We then come to the disproportionate reaction there's been, and to the situation we now have, where Tucker Carlson did an interview yesterday. It was quite an interesting interview, actually. I mean, he's the right-wing commentator in America, fell out with Trump, but is deeply critical of this. And he was constantly criticizing Israel, but denied that he was anti-Semitic. But, they do believe that Israel more or less misled Trump as to the ease with which this could be dealt with. But now, of course, they seem to be out of control. I mean, was it so incompetent that it wasn't clear that the Lebanese action was also included in the ceasefire? I suppose, given the level of amateurness that the United States has brought to this, it's possible that they hadn't tied that down. But we've now got a situation where, as far as I know, the Lebanese thing is still going on, and it makes the peace pretty impossible.
There is no way that the Iranians would have signed any sort of ceasefire deal without the inclusion of Lebanon, because they would not have put off Hezbollah and the Houthis. And had they simply said, we don't care what the Israelis continue to do in Gaza and Lebanon, they lose the support of their agents in the region, very important agents as far as Iran are concerned. So it is absolutely ridiculous to believe that the Americans were able to get the Iranians to sign that type of deal. I think more likely, Jim, is the point that you make, that America potentially were amateurish and didn't read the small print. More likely, they were desperate to get away from Trump's catastrophic threat of annihilation of Iran. And so almost any deal was going to be suggested as a basis for further negotiations and conversations, because Trump was not able to go ahead with what he'd threatened. And so I don't think that this ceasefire was ever going to hold. I don't think it was ever a proper deal. And I think it was an excuse to get Trump off the hook. But where we are now, Joe, is in a position that 6 weeks ago we would have been shaking our heads and saying, well, even Trump isn't this daft. But the situation is that Russia and China are in a much stronger position strategically in terms of global affairs now. China are apparently having conversations with Iran about them putting military bases in Iran at some point in the not too distant future. What do the Yanks do then? Israel continue to bomb hell out of their near neighbours in Lebanon, losing what little respect and credibility Israel now has as a country. And I take the points that you make, Jim, in terms of the threats that nation has faced over many, many decades now, which we would all be fervent critics of. But Netanyahu's actions have totally undermined the nation state of Israel and have produced a situation where now 60% of Americans are saying that Israel is not a friend of their country. And you only have to look at the streets of European cities across the whole of the EU, and of course here in the UK, the protests that are taking place against that Israeli regime. So what this conflict has managed to do, Joe, is strengthen an Iranian regime that was under significant pressure, protests domestically that they were facing, give Putin all the cards as far as Ukraine is now concerned, because the American intervention there is going to be significantly weakened, and China emerges as the stable European superpower. It's an absolute shit show, isn't it?
Yes, that's one way of putting it, Frank. I'm not sure that's the language they'd use in a diplomatic mission.
Oh, I think they would.
Yes.
Trump certainly would.
Uses worse, doesn't he?
Well, they probably would. Yes, 6 weeks ago, ships could go in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. Trump's thing, and Jim is only half right, Trump's idea is that from this afternoon, they will also stop any vessels that have paid a toll to Iran. So that does include international shipping as well. And of course, you know, what they've done is absolutely underlined to the Iranian regime that you've got this fantastic leverage over the rest of the world, which maybe they weren't aware of. I'm sure they were, but maybe not so in how quickly it would impact everything. 6 weeks ago, and 6 weeks ago, the people of Iran were, protesting on the streets, and they were told by President Trump, "Stay, carry on protesting, help is coming." And it's made it 10 times worse for them. Meanwhile, 2,000 people have died in Lebanon that we know of, and many, many hundreds more injured. Israel, as you say, carries on. And that meeting you alluded to with Netanyahu and Trump was back in November, Frank. And it's not that long after Israel and America had claimed, back in the autumn last year, that they had seriously, if not destroyed, but they had had a huge impact on Iran's nuclear stocks. Well, funny that they still seem to have those, isn't it, really? So I think you're absolutely right. And interestingly, China, who is becoming a much bigger player in all of this, they get a lot of their oil from Iran. And of course, Putin is making an absolute fortune because his oil is going around the world, which means he's got lots more money to spend on bombing Ukraine. No, it's absolutely ridiculous. But the other thing is, and as you both said, amateurism doesn't even half describe it. There is no way you could reach a ceasefire in the short time without endless documentation and small print. I don't think anything was even written down. I think this was done as a deal, like a handshake. And the idea that J.D. Vance and the two property magnates could do a deal between a round of golf and going to support Orbán in Hungary, which we'll come on to in a minute, is utterly bonkers. Anybody who has ever dealt in foreign affairs knows you have to have back channels, you have to roll the pitch, you have to talk to all the players, you have to get things lined up, and you open the door, which is significant because that's the first time Iranians and Americans have met face to face for 2 generations, really. So the door is not closed, but Trump had an opportunity to go, yeah, okay, we're moving on. I'm leaving the Lego on the floor. You can clear it up because I'm now going to get out the poster paints and go to Cuba. But he didn't. He can't resist it. And now, also interesting to see how J.D. Vance reacts to this. He's lashed out at the Pope, of all people, after making that revolting speech on Easter Sunday. Over the Easter weekend. He's now accused the Pope of being a bad guy, and he wouldn't even be in the Vatican if Trump wasn't in the White House.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that in terms of, let's pick any ally we can to fall out with. The last one you'd think be on the list would be the Pope, but he's even managed to do that. So, Jim, let me just move the conversation on a touch, because I think we can all agree that this has been a total catastrophe as far as it being a strategically planned war is concerned. If it was ever that, I don't think he understood or appreciated half of the challenges that he was going to face. Netanyahu, I think, did, which really does place, for me, a huge dark cloud over this Israeli administration. I think it's evil. I think Netanyahu has obviously got his own pragmatic personal reasons for wishing conflicts to continue. But I think there are people in and around that administration who, as I say, are pure evil. But let's return to the impact that it's having geopolitically. And two things I want to ask you, Jim. The first may sound a little facetious and now I'm taking the piss, but I'm honestly not. Because of your historical understanding and experiences, I wonder whether this could be America's Suez. And I want to get your serious contemplation on that. And then I want to ask both of you whether you think this is the end of NATO. I'll start with you on the Suez question, if I may, Jim.
Yes, that's the allusion to the fact that the British Empire and our illusions that we were the major players in the Middle East were shattered when the United States failed to support our invasion of Suez in order to take the Suez Canal back from the President Nasser of Egypt. I think there is a real chance, and I try and look at this in a slightly broader context than just Trump. I try and look forward to a future Republican president, which is easier to see a continuity of policy. But even with a Democratic president, whether the United States' reputation in the world now is shattered, and this is so important. You've alluded to China already, and China is playing a very clever game, in my opinion, although it's messing about in the South China Seas with putting runways on atolls and annoying the Filipinos. But generally speaking, China is seen as the quiet, respectable diplomatic power, and the United States is increasingly seen as erratic and unpredictable. And the conclusion of the American people might be to return to isolationism, which is a policy that they used to adopt. Because if you're living in Nebraska or South Dakota, believe me, I've been to those places. All this is a long way away. And you can make, and that has been made in the past, an argument that the United States should just look after itself, and that would have huge consequences for NATO. So I think you're absolutely right to raise that. I think this could have profound implications, because the United States' credibility to project itself by force, it was always the second prong, that they were a democratic country, that were generally supporting their Western allies, and some of the things they did weren't very wise. But now that's all shot. Now they're seen as erratic and hostile. I think it's a debate that's going to develop.
And what about NATO, Joe? Do you think that this is the beginning of the end? Do we need to start to create a new NATO, if I can put it that way, a new security force that isn't as reliant on the United States? And let me just add this as well. Would that not have been something that would have been a sensible approach to take a decade or so ago, when even friendly presidents such as Obama was raising the fact that they felt they were overpaying as far as NATO was concerned?
Yes and yes. I mean, certainly it would have been prescient to think about an alternative to NATO when Russia invaded Ukraine, and think about it a little bit more urgently. I think, there are really big questions here about whether America, certainly under Trump and possibly after Trump, can be trusted. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you withdraw from Five Eyes, the security service sharing. But when you have somebody like Pete Hegseth, the cartoon man with suits who are too small, and who treats war as a video game, when you see him firing senior military commanders and generals, you have to question whether you should be sharing sensitive information with a so-called ally, because we've also seen, there's a whole different podcast here, but the way that the markets appear to have been manipulated by the timing of Trump's announcements. Now somebody somewhere is making an awful lot of money out of this deadly conflict, and I suspect that it begins with tr and ends in ump, and that's possibly the whole family. I don't think NATO is finished. But I do think it is absolutely paramount, and the getting rid of Viktor Orbán in Hungary is a really big step on the way to this, that Europe needs to up its defence. I mean, at the moment, NATO spends something like 64%, or 64% of NATO's funding comes from, 62% of NATO's total defence spending comes from the US military budget. I mean, that is unsustainable, regardless of Trump, whether it was Obama or Clinton or whoever. And, you know, there are intelligence capabilities that the Pentagon's got. But overall, Europe as a united entity has got more defence capability, maybe not, you know, in terms of power, but in quantity and access and sophistication, if you like, than America. So it would seem to me that we really, really have to bite the bullet, if that's not a horrible pun, and actually ramp up a European-centric organisation that runs parallel with NATO. But if, you know, as we see, I mean, Trump said in 2014 he wanted to withdraw from NATO. So you're quite right, Frank. You know, a decade ago, somebody might have been thinking, hey, supposing that guy gets in, maybe we should be looking at an alternative. And maybe we should be, you know, thinking about bringing in Ukraine and other countries as, you know, subsidiary members or something like that. It needs reworking, it needs modernising, but above all, there needs to be a European commitment to a defensive bloc where all of the European partners work together, and that includes the UK.
And Canada and Australia, I guess.
Yes,
I think
and Japan.
Yeah, the big fear now, I think that if you listen to military personnel from across across Europe, is that Russia see this as a great opportunity, and that they may test NATO by not just looking at Ukraine, but maybe Estonia, taking a part of Estonia, which of course, you know, large proportion of their population Russian speaking. Putin obviously has ambitions to grow the Russian bloc once again, and get towards what they had when it was the old Soviet Union. So the test may come sooner than we would like, but it could come very quickly. And as I say, Russia will be looking at what's happening at the moment in terms of some of Trump's pronouncements over NATO and the NATO allies starting to get their elbows out as far as the Trump presidency is concerned, it seems to me, and thinking that this is their opportunity. So it's a very torrid and worrying time, something that continues to play out. We'll see what happens over the next 7 days, a subject that we will undoubtedly return to next week. But as I say, it's of Trump's making, all of this chaos, and well, thanks to the American people for putting him back into the White House. Anyway.
And Netanyahu as well. I mean, I just wanted to say
absolutely.
I mean, you're right. It seems to me that the Netanyahu. Well, there are arguably three factions. There's people like Smotrich, who's one of his cabinet members, who believes in Greater Israel, which would include southern Lebanon, the whole of Judea and Samaria, and he just wants to do it by conquest. There's Netanyahu, who it seems to me doesn't have a long-term view of foreign policy, but it is by violent action to suppress the enemies without any sort of peace settlement at all. And of course, he still has these personal problems when he leaves office, as you say.
Yeah, as I say, it's an issue that's going to continue to dominate the headlines over the next 7 days. So we'll return next week. Hopefully someone, somewhere will be able to come up with a solution that can at least give Trump an opportunity to walk away with some credibility. But it's beyond my doing, to be honest. I've thought of every sort of scenario where he may be able to claim some sort of victory here, but it's not an obvious thing for me. So let's see what happens, as I say, over the next week. Right, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about elections, one that's happened in Hungary and some that are going to be taking place in the UK in the next few weeks. Stay with us. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And we're going to talk about the election that happened over the weekend in Hungary. So we saw Vice President J.D. Vance going across to Hungary about a week or so ago, saying what a fantastic leader Viktor Orbán was, and the fact that he'd been in power for 16 years, an absolutely horrendous regime from a Liberal Democrats perspective in terms of liberal democracy. I'm talking now, not Liberal Democrat Party. Somebody who had interfered with the judiciary, somebody who had overtaken the media, and also made it very clear that he was anti-EU, despite taking lots of money from the European Union, and pro-Putin, was one of the people that consistently argued against support for Ukraine. And so it was disappointing, if not surprising, to see J.D. Vance going across to support him, and to see the American administration lining up with the Russian administration and Putin. But apparently, following J.D. Vance's visit, Viktor Orbán lost a further 3% in the polls. And of course, over the weekend, his opponent, Peter Magyar, has surged to a landslide victory. Magyar, for what it's worth, is not what we would consider politically aligned to progressives. He still has a quite traditional view on things such as immigration and faith and religion, but nevertheless, he was far more progressive in terms of things such as corruption, the judiciary, the media, and crucially, is anti-Putin, anti-Russia, and pro-Ukraine. So, Joe, a bit of good news from Hungary, and much needed given the geopolitical environment that we were outlining in the first part of today's podcast.
Yes, absolutely. I was in Budapest not that long ago, actually, and looking at the coverage last night on the television and seeing the city absolutely full to bursting with people, and the turnout was huge. The result was overwhelming. I think it's quite funny, really, that J.D. Vance was there backing Orbán and bemoaning outside interference in European elections. There's no sense of irony, is there, in America? I know they don't get humour, but they don't get irony either. And I was quite surprised that Orbán conceded relatively graciously, actually. I mean, it was overwhelming, so he couldn't say, use a reform argument about family voting or somebody going into a toll booth or something like that. You know, there's no question. And you're right, Frank. I mean, Peter Magyar is certainly to the right of most of European parties, but he is he's won and campaigned on an anti-corruption ticket, which has absolutely wrecked Hungary's economy. You know, people go there and they see clean streets and they think it's absolutely lovely, and there's no immigration, there's no free press. And Orbán's mates over the last 16 years have lined their pockets very nicely, thank you, while the economy's tanked. But Peter Magyar is good news, particularly for Ukraine, because if you remember, Hungary blocked the release of 90 million euros, which could have gone to Ukraine. He's also been absolutely, allied to Putin. This is quite a blow for Putin, actually, because he's lost a puppet within the EU. And I think it's very significant. It will make it a lot easier for the rest of Europe to get together, to become more cohesive. And what we were talking about in the first half of the podcast, if we are going towards a European defence bloc, then this election in Hungary makes that much easier and it is a badly needed ray of light in some very dark clouds.
Jim, good result, and some of the points that Joe's raised there, I'm sure you wish to comment on as well, but it is a good night for the European Union.
Yes, a lot of questions have been asked about what the European Union stands for when you've got a member who is affecting the judiciary politically and the free press politically. I mean, I took the view that Hungary should have been suspended from the European Union, but that might have had an adverse effect on public opinion, so no one should listen to me. But I was outraged by it. I mean, I've still got some reservation about some of the things that Poland's done in relation to the sort of code of behaviour of the European Union. But nevertheless, and we might touch on this later on, given the British position on the European Union, which is strengthening by the day, the idea that it was going to be swept away in the tide of the sort of dictators and the strong men of the world, and maybe the Europe, and bearing in mind what you both have said about defence, maybe this European Union entity is going to strengthen in the face of a troubled world. I mean, once again, what naivety by the United States. I mean, where's the advice? Surely if they realised the scale of the defeat that Orbán was going to suffer, putting the Vice President of the United States in a position like this to go in and back a loser, it's another embarrassment for them. Two words of caution. Obviously, as you probably know, Orbán was never popular in Budapest itself. His strength was always in the Hungarian countryside. So those huge demonstrations in Budapest last night sort of represent that. But obviously he couldn't have won without the countryside turning on him as well. So, yes, a piece of good news. But you're right to point to Magyar's politics. He's not a sort of left winger at all, but he does believe in the European Union and crucially believes in a firm stand against the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah,
I think the other thing
sorry, Joe, go on.
Well, just to say that it's very interesting, going back to what we were saying about, how people have turned against Trump, that the right-wing parties, the populist parties in Europe, are now trying to distance themselves quite vociferously from the MAGA movement and from Trump, including, National Rally in France and AfD in Germany. And obviously, the J.D. Vance effect is great. Let's hope he comes and campaigns for reform. That's what I would like to see.
And Maloney in Italy has distanced herself as well. So you're right. It's had a huge impact in terms of European politics generally. And I was about to say I'm just reading the latest reports from Hungary, and apparently as the new Prime Minister took to the stage, the chants from the crowd were "Russians go home," and he announced that this result means a return to Europe. So in a nutshell, I think that basically captures what that result means to the Hungarians and to the European Union as well. And as you say, Joe, what does appear to be the case, we've seen this in other elections, haven't we, most notably Canada, is that Trump can be a vote loser if you align yourself too closely to him. You remember in Canada, the Conservative Party there was miles ahead in the polls, 25-30% ahead. Trump's elected as President of the United States, and Carney overtakes the Tories and wins with a huge thumping majority. So, yeah, let's hope that sort of translates into UK elections and elsewhere in Europe. So let's turn in May as Jim's picture disappears and comes back onto the screen. I don't think it's going to impact this on what's happening domestically. I think people are going to use the local elections and the elections for the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly to give the government a bit of a kicking. I think it's also clear that the Tories have continued to struggle despite sort of early signs in this year that Kemi Badenoch was starting to get her act together. I think she had a bit of a mare over the last month or so, not least because, of course, on day one, she called for Keir Starmer to get behind the conflict in Iran and support the Americans with troops. And that's that's gone down like a lead balloon with British people. You look at all the polls, and Starmer actually is very well supported as far as that particular issue is concerned. But overall, Jim, I still think it's going to be difficult set of election results for Labour. And then we get ourselves into this multi-party situation, don't we, where you can see the Greens doing well, you can see the Nationalists in both Wales and Scotland doing well. Reform, obviously, are going to continue to pick up some seats. So what do we think will happen? Let's talk about my prediction and the polls. Fairly accurate, would you say, Jim? Can't see any big turnaround simply because Trump's been disastrous as far as the Iranian conflict is concerned.
No, it is disappointing for Labour that Sir Keir Starmer's stance, which has been widely supported by people, doesn't seem to have shifted the dial much in Labour's favour. I think the thing is that people are heavily focused on the cost of living and don't think that the government have solved that problem. So Labour look to be in for a real hammering. I mean, talking about a loss of over 1,000 councillors. I mean, obviously they're under a sort of three-pronged attack in England. London, where all the boroughs are out, there's going to be a strong showing by the Green Party. In the home counties, the Liberal Democrats are on the march. And then we come to the north of England, where Reform are hoping to do well. I mean, I remain intensely interested in whether playing places like Manchester and Leeds and Bradford and Newcastle and places like that, how far Reform will actually penetrate the real urban areas. But so in England, it looks very difficult for Labour. In Scotland, it looks as if because of the division between Reform and the Conservatives, and Anas Hawa's sort of breach with Keir Starmer has not been a great look. Labour are not able to go on the offensive in an election which at one stage they looked as if they might really make an impact on. It looks as if the SNP are riding home. And then Wales is quite fascinating, where Reform and the Greens look as if they're going to topple Labour after 100 years. So it does look like a really bad night for Labour, and we may come on to talk about what the consequences might be for the leadership of the Labour Party in a minute. I don't think there'll be any change, but you'll have your views.
Yeah, I think the other thing, though, that is important to note is that if you look at historically this set of election results, few governments do well. Administrations often find that in midterm local elections, people take their angst out against the government. And the sad thing about this is that it does impact on what's happening locally and regionally, and more so now whilst you've got devolution. So we can just use a live example where I'm sat in the Liverpool City region. Most people would concede, whatever the politics, that Steve Rotherham is doing a decent job. He's started to win additional investment from government. He's cracking on with some really important strategic projects. And he's now got the complication potentially of St Helens becoming a reform council, and therefore a reform leader sat on his cabinet trying to basically create a little bit of havoc and get in the way of that progress. So it's sad, isn't it, Joe? It's always been the way, but you often get good local government councillors, good leaders losing their seats or losing control because of what's happening nationally, which is a testament to the weakness, really, of local government. And it's something we've campaigned in favour of changing for many, many years now. But we're going to be in a situation, I think, Joe, where towns and cities across the country have buyer's remorse very quickly. And tell us about that by-election that took place in your part of the world in Kent this week.
So, as you will remember, Reform swept to power, sweeping the Conservatives out of power ever since, well, before Jim was a boy, actually, that long. So Reform took Kent County Council. There was a by-election in East Kent in a ward in Margate, very, very highly deprived area, despite all the, the trendiness of Margate and the Turner Contemporary and all the rest of it. And the reason the by-election was called was because the Reform councillor was sent to prison for assaulting his wife. So there was a by-election. And the Greens won it with a huge turnout, 37%, which is a very high turnout for a local by-election. I mean, Zach Polanski came down to Margate and, the pub was crammed, lots and lots of people. Robert Jenrick came down for Reform. I don't think it was particularly crammed.
Like the J.D. Vance effect.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is exactly right. Lib Dems had no hope, and the Conservatives might have hoped in different times that they would have regained the seat. But I think what's interesting, well, two things. One is that we know support for the Greens has surged, particularly among younger people. But in order to vote, you've got to be on the register, and then you've actually got to go out and do it. So when you see a little result, it's only a little, snapshot. But I think that's significant. That's not just, oh, yeah, we like Zach Polanski. Oh, I forgot to put my name on the poll card. They actually did it. But I think you're absolutely right, Frank. Too many people vote in local elections and they see it as a protest against Keir Starmer or Kemi Badenoch or whoever it is without stopping to think. I mean, I was just looking at Poll Checker here, and the predictions at the moment are that 45 councils up for election are expected to change hands in May. 67, this is more interesting, I think, will become no overall control. So this comes back to your point about reform in St Helens, where you have to work with people who you absolutely, are at opposite sides of the political spectrum. And I think London will be a disaster for Labour, and they will probably lose control of quite a few councils to the Greens. In other areas, I think it'll be anybody but Reform. And I think Scotland and Wales will be very interesting to see whether the nationalist parties become that, keep Reform out. And I think, this really should make the government come on. We've gone beyond two parties now. You've got to bring in PR, because otherwise we're just going to go through this nonsense time after time with, people have won a walloping majority, but it's very, very thin. So you can't do anything. We've seen that with the government. And at local level, it becomes even harder. And if we're going to have successful, devolved powers, we need all those really good, talented, committed local politicians who are willing to work with other parties where it's appropriate. But you can't do it on protest votes and slogans. It's too important.
Yeah, but isn't there it's an interesting, I mean, I'm generally in favour of PR, but I mean, it will mean that that Steve Rotherham does have to deal with Reform and maybe some Greens. I mean, that is the result of PR elections. It means far more no-overall controls, far more coalition building required. And you were sort of saying, oh, it's a shame and all this sort of stuff, but you'd have to deal with a more complex situation.
But it's much more grown up, Jim, because then you say to people, whether you've got that Reform councillor sitting in your cabinet saying, okay, so how are you going to do it? I mean, what we've seen is so many people, particularly in Reform, who have come into council positions with no experience of anything, nothing. They haven't even been out canvassing for another party in the past. They've just come in and they haven't got a clue about how it works. And it's too important. It's about social care. It's about roads. It's about education. It's about, local
yes, but
services.
Reforms say, just very briefly, Reforms say this is a result of the British public, the non-political British publics, looking at the old parties and saying, you have not solved our problems. And it's actually a good thing that totally inexperienced people are coming into politics. That's our verdict. You've not solved it. So we're going to have fresh faces.
Yeah.
Maybe they're inexperienced, but at least they're different from the failed main parties.
But my point is that if you had PR and you had more of that coalition, you would be able to get more things done. And those people who, for, quite understandable reasons in some places might vote Green or might vote Reform, will actually get a better deal than feeling perpetually pissed off and then using their vote as a protest for no end.
more power to local government, more power to mayors, get people to take these
Absolutely.
elections more seriously and not simply treat them as a way to protest about what's happening at national government level. That is the answer to this conundrum. I'm afraid it's not going to happen anytime soon. There will be some additional powers given, I think fiscal powers maybe in the budget to mayors, but it didn't go nearly far enough. So we'll see what develops. We'll be coming back to this subject, of course, between now and the May elections. Just in terms of your point, Jim, whilst the chaos on the international arena continues, I don't think there is any appetite amongst the Labour Party membership or the PLP start to indulge in a leadership election. Nonetheless, I don't think that the question of Keir Starmer's future has gone away, and it will much depend, I think, on how these conflicts emerge in terms of where they finish up, and whether or not at some point he and the government can find the narrative that we've spoken about so often to convince people in the country that they're actually making a difference for the good. And I have to say that I read on a weekly basis some of the good things the government are doing, but no bugger knows about them. So unless and until they begin to tell a story and create a vision of where they see the country going, and I'm not sure Keir's got a vision, if I'm honest, then, as I say, that question mark over his leadership is going to continue. As interestingly, perhaps, is what we think will happen with Kemi Badenoch if they take a pasting. Is there any appetite within the Tory party, do you think, Jim, to change horses at this stage, or are they still wounded by the number of changes that happened when they were in government?
I'm sure Mel Stride would answer the call if such a thing should happen. Now, I don't actually. Funnily enough, it was some time ago, but I listened yesterday to her Desert Island Discs.
Oh God,
it's just quite a strange collection of stuff. She has had a very, very interesting story, and has obviously been toughened by her experience as a child in Nigeria and then going to America and all this sort of stuff. So I think she's quite tough. I think the Tories are haunted by this, notion, which they still get taunted with, and rightly so, of changing prime ministers and leaders every 5 minutes. So I don't think so. I think there'll be sort of disappointment on the Conservative side, but a realization that they, as they were after 1997, even under a better leader, arguably, although a young man at the time, William Hague, that they've got years in the wilderness, and it's better just to potter along with Kemi at this stage. And then when power becomes, if the reform bubble bursts, let's just be fair, there are some signs that they have plateaued. Their poll ratings are lower than 6 months ago, possibly because people are observing their performance in office in some of the councils that they control. That may be having an effect, and also their relations with Trump and Putin, I don't think are helpful. But I'd be surprised if there's a move against Kemi.
Okay, well, we will find out in a few weeks' time what those results hold, and of course the other big question is, if the Nationalists do particularly well in the Welsh Assembly elections and the Scottish parliamentary elections, whether that then enables the Nationalists to reintroduce the prospect of independence for Wales and Scotland. I would have thought after the Brexit vote we'd had enough chaos to the United Kingdom, but you never know. So that's another week gone by, and another week of fascinating conversation. Well, fascinating for us three. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. Francesca's managed to stay awake, so that's a good sign. We'll be back next week talking about, I'm sure, the Iranian conflict, but much more besides. Thanks for joining us as ever. Thanks for listening. Have a great 7 days. We'll see you next week.